El Corrido de Roberto Bolaño. In September, there were almost no killings of women. There were fights. There were drug deals and arrests. There were parties and long hot nights. There were trucks loaded with cocaine crossing the desert. There were Cessna planes flying low over the desert like the spirits of Catholic Indians ready to slit everyone's throats. There were whispered conversations and laughter and narcocorridos as background music. Roberto Bolaño never mentions him by name, but the reference to narcocorridos in his final novel, 2666, will surely spark thoughts of one particular individual in any reader familiar with the musical genre, Chalino Sánchez. Regarded as the father of the narcocorrido, Chalino has had an incalculable impact on Mexican popular culture over the past 30 years. And though he and Bolaño never met, their respective visions provide crucial context in understanding the country as it exists now. Join us today as we examine recent Mexican history through the lens of these two very different writers. I'm your host, Bob. Now please, sit back and enjoy today's edition of Lit Tips. 2666 focuses on several characters who, for a variety of reasons, make their way to the fictional Mexican city of Santa Teresa. The city is located along the Mexico-Texas border and is intended as a stand-in for Ciudad Juarez. The novel's most memorable section, titled The Part About the Crimes, outlines in horrific clinical detail an epidemic of brutal unsolved murders plaguing the city. The vast majority of victims are poor working-class women who more often than not have nobody who can accurately identify them to the police. As the murder rate climbs, so too does the frustration of the city's populace. The assumed culprit behind the killings is the vast network of drug cartels terrorizing Santa Teresa and the rest of the country. But as years pass with no progress made on bringing the killers to justice, it becomes increasingly hard for Santa Teresa's citizens to shake the notion that the criminals are being protected by the very authorities the public has entrusted to apprehend them.
Viviana was 16 when the killers snatched her from the city center. I'd expected her father, Jose Reyes, to be angry, and he was. But to my surprise, his anger wasn't just aimed at the killers, but also at the police.
Bolaño always wrote about Mexico from an outsider's perspective. He was born in Chile in 1953 and had moved with his family to Mexico City in the late 1960s. He had a difficult time in school and eventually dropped out. Supporting himself where he could as a journalist, he followed the news back home closely. He was far from being the only one. At the start of the 1970s, Chile elected Salvador Allende as its first democratic socialist president. Bolaño, along with many other Chileans of his generation, saw this as a great opportunity for the country. In 1973, Bolaño returned to Chile to take part in the revolution, but greater forces had other ideas. On September 11th of that year, a coup, organized and carried out at the behest of the United States, ousted Allende and replaced him with General Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet would go on to rule Chile through a regime marked by extreme violence and repression for decades. Bolaño found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was captured and held in a prison for over a week with no idea if he would make it out alive. He was released when, by a stroke of luck, two policemen assigned to his case turned out to be old school friends of his. Bolaño returned to Mexico City, and having witnessed the bitter failure of Chile's revolution firsthand, decided instead to lead one of his own in Mexico. Only this revolution wouldn't be strictly political. Rather, it would be an assault on what he and his contemporaries saw as the staid, lifeless state of Mexican literature. They called themselves the Infrarealists, and their stated mission was to level and then rebuild Mexican poetry and literature in their own image. At the same time, hundreds of miles away from Mexico City in the rural state of Sinaloa, events were taking place that to this day are a source of endless speculation and debate. Chalino Sánchez was the youngest of 7 children born to poor ranchers outside of Culiacan. He displayed an aptitude for singing and songwriting from an early age, but due to his family's financial situation, he had no means by which to pursue formal training. As a result, his voice had a rough, barking quality that no one at the time would have dreamed could attract a large audience. The style Chalino excelled at was the corrido. Corridos were traditional polka-inspired folk ballads detailing the heroic exploits of their protagonists. During the Mexican Revolution, they had worked as oral newspapers for illiterate peasants eager to hear the news of figures like Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. Corridos persisted for decades as a popular form, But by the 1970s, their popularity was on the wane, and they were largely considered old-fashioned and outdated. Chalino's early life was marred by repeated tragedy. His father died when he was just 4 years old. Then, in 1975, his sister was abducted and raped by the associate of a local landowner named El Chapo Perez. The family was devastated but had no recourse. Chalino, who was only about 14 at the time, sought out El Chapo himself and threatened him, saying that as soon as he was old enough to buy his first gun, he would shoot El Chapo in the chest with it. El Chapo laughed him off and Chalino bided his time. Back in Mexico City, the infrarealist movement was rapidly deteriorating. Infighting, jealousies, and affairs between members had fractured the group beyond repair. Hangers-on had abandoned their idealism. The ideas of Bolaño and the movement's co-founder, Mario Santiago Papasquiaro, were criticized and denounced. Many infrarealists called into question whether Bolaño had actually returned to Chile at all, let alone been arrested. Soon Bolaño was thinking of leaving Mexico for good. He did so in 1977, eventually settling in the Catalonian beach town of Blanes, where he would remain for the rest of his life. By the time Bolaño had embarked for Europe, Chalino had been planning his revenge for 2 years. He acquired a pistol and, in front of a crowd gathered for a Revolution Day celebration, delivered on his threat and murdered El Chapo in cold blood. He was forced to flee Sinaloa and, after months of traveling and working odd jobs, arrived in Tijuana. There he began work as a coyote, transporting immigrants across the border into California.
Right now in the Chicano or Mexican ghettos in Los Angeles, we have a tremendous economic depression where over 25% of our working people are unemployed. But we only make up 7.4 of the jobs in the city when we pay our taxes just like everybody else. But that 7.4 is a false figure because many of these jobs, maybe 1/3 of them, are political jobs that they give in an election year, and the jobs won't last past November for 6 months.
In the early 1980s, Chalino settled in East Los Angeles. He continued working as a coyote, and in 1984 was arrested in Tijuana. During his 8-month sentence in La Mesa prison, he developed a reputation as a songwriter. Soon his fellow prisoners were commissioning him to write original corridos based on their own lives in the criminal underworld. Among those he met in La Mesa was a man named Roberto Campos. Campos was a respected member of the Guadalajara cartel with whom Chalino would cross paths several times in the following years. Without knowing it at the time, Chalino was in a way leading a revolution of his own, one that would long outlive and have infinitely more influence than Bolaño's. As he sat in his cell transcribing the lives of the inmates into the structures of traditional ballads, he was breathing new life and relevance into a form that had by then been written off as the music of a bygone generation. The style he'd helped popularize came to be known as narcocorrido. When he was released, Chalino returned to Los Angeles, where he for a time became the personal driver for Roberto Campos. Word had spread beyond the walls of La Mesa of his songwriting talents, and soon he was taking commissions from interested parties on the outside. His fame grew rapidly. He performed often at clubs popular among the city's bustling Mexican community. While hesitant to do so at first, he began recording his songs with the accompaniment of numerous backing bands. The most prominent among them was Los Amables del Norte, originally formed by accordionist Nacho Hernandez. Young immigrants and children of immigrants, who had previously expressed no interest in corridos, had adopted early hip-hop culture as their own, as it provided the only alternative to the Anglo-oriented pop music marketed to them. Chalino's recordings changed things entirely, and helped these youths reconnect with their homeland in a way that felt both exciting and ultra-modern.
And I will ask you to get involved in what promises to be a very difficult fight. This is crack cocaine.
As Chalino's fame rose, so did tensions in Mexico's ongoing drug war. The public had been led to believe that joint efforts between the Mexican authorities and the DEA would bring the chaos under control. Instead, the violence had increased exponentially. With the foundation of the Sinaloa cartel in 1989, many members took the opportunity to settle old scores. Among the victims of these retaliations was Roberto Campos, who was gunned down in his car in Tijuana. Fortunately for Chalino, he was no longer working as Campos's driver. Chalino wouldn't elude the violence for long, however. In January of 1992, while performing in Coachella, California, an intoxicated man rushed the stage and pulled a gun on Chalino. Chalino, always armed himself, drew his pistol and fired first. He missed and was himself shot several times. He barely survived but was widely believed to have been killed. ABC World News Tonight reported the story, marking the first time narco-corrido culture was acknowledged by the mainstream media. Only a few months later, against the pleas of family and friends, Chalino accepted an invitation to perform in Culiacan. Before leaving Los Angeles, He sold the rights to his entire discography for less than $200,000 and left the money with his wife. During the performance on the night of May 16, 1992, Chalino was handed a note by a stranger. If it wasn't already clear, he seemed to know at that moment that this would be his last public appearance. After the show, Chalino, along with one of his brothers and a cousin, drove out of Culiacan. On the outskirts of town, they were pulled over by two black Chevy Suburbans. A man dressed as a police officer got out of one of them, saying that the group was being taken in. Chalino struck a deal with the officers that he would go with them if the others were left alone. The Suburbans drove off into the night. The next morning, Chalino's body was found in a ditch with 2 bullets in the back of his head. Chalinos Death sent a shockwave through the community in East Los Angeles. Almost overnight, sales of his recordings, the proceeds now going entirely to the record companies thanks to Chalino having signed his royalty rights away, skyrocketed. Imitators took to copying Chalino's signature look and vocal stylings. But there was a fundamental difference between the imitators and Chalino himself. Chalino's own life had been the stuff of Corrido legend in its own right, while the imitators only had the cultural signifiers he'd popularized of which to draw and emulate. And to make up for their lack of authenticity, rather than innovate, many of them instead pushed these same signifiers to their extremes. Glorifications of violence and persistent attempts at one-upmanship permeated the narcocorrido scene. Nacho Hernandez, interviewed in 2019, stated, "The older songs are the ones that ring most true. Today's lyrics are awful. There's no sentimentality. They're all simplicity and no soul. The old songs always had something to say." Coinciding with the rise of narcocorrido culture following Chalino's murder was the ever-increasing level of cartel violence in Mexico.
The Mexicans call it the City of the Lost Girls. Ciudad Juarez is held hostage by killers who've slaughtered almost 400 women.
A wave of international outcry came in response with calls for internal investigations into the authorities many believed had become compromised, infiltrated, or simply were working in tandem with the cartels. And keeping an eye on these proceedings from afar, just as years before he'd watched the developments in his home country from Mexico, was Roberto Bolaño. 2666 stands as his magnum opus, and this likely would have been the case even if he hadn't died before its publication in 2004. The novel represents his deepest exploration of all the themes he engaged with throughout his career. The importance of the written word itself, the inescapable ghosts of history, the unseen threads that tie seemingly disparate people and events together across international and temporal borders, and dozens of others. Santa Teresa exists as a microcosm not just of the current crises faced by Mexico, but of the modern world in its entirety. A world so overwhelmed by overlapping and compounded catastrophe that imagining any sort of solution or alternative can seem futile. In spite of this, Bolaño ends the part about the crimes on an, if not positive, at least not entirely defeated note. And accompanying the imagery he describes, it's not hard to imagine the distant strains of Chalino's voice emanating from a radio somewhere in the depths of these same dark streets. The Christmas holidays in Santa Teresa were celebrated in the usual fashion. There were posadas, piñatas were smashed, tequila and beer were drunk. Even on the poorest streets, people could be heard laughing. Some of these streets were completely dark, like black holes, and the laughter that came from who knows where was the only sign, the only beacon that kept residents and strangers from getting lost. We hope that you enjoyed this edition of Lit Tips. As always, hit that like button if you like what we're doing, subscribe for more videos on literature from your favorites to the plain obscure, hit that bell if you want to be notified when videos drop, and leave a comment with your thoughts on this video along with any suggestions for books or authors you would like us to cover in future episodes. Until next time, keep reading.